I'm going to take you through a relatively large number of slides to try to cover, as we think about the technology space and the innovation space, how does blockchain sort of fit into the innovation journey? How do we think about the implications of blockchain technology very broadly, from enterprise to finance, because clearly there's a big aspects of financial technology. And one of the interesting things about supply chain and why I'm spending so much time over the past couple of years in supply chain and now actually full-time in supply chain is that it allows you to actually meld together physical traceability, itemized serialization of goods, and the digital counterparts to those things. So the documentation might be in the form of a PDF or a Word document or a bill of lading associated with those goods. And then the financial flows as well. And blockchain, hopefully you'll get a sense from the broad coverage that I do today, that blockchain actually does a really good job taking those three independent flows and allowing you to condense them into a single atomic type of object, and therefore do new different things with it and do things that are much more efficient than you could do with separate flows. So let me share my screen, and as I mentioned, I'm going to be taking you through a little bit of a journey here. So first, let me get full screen here. And I have done similar discussions before around a topic that I like to call radical decentralization. And so when we think about innovation journeys, we want to think fairly radically. So we might as well do that when we're talking about the approaches to technology. I'm talking a little bit about here, as I mentioned, radical decentralization is terminology that we use when we think about how do we move from where we are today in siloed systems into much more decentralized and decentrally governed systems. And we'll talk a little bit about that through this session. I also sort of overlay this on some of the issues that we're seeing on the web and how, I think as well as some of the internet founders think that this technology actually has an opportunity to address some of the shortcomings of the web. Coincidentally, I just had a conversation yesterday with one of our folks who works on DNS and ICANN, and was asking about, like, how should we be thinking about decentralization and the impact of blockchain as we think about DNS. And that's a great example of where, sort of some of the shortcomings in the web. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that in this session today. So in 2015, I got together with a colleague and we started this journey of blockchain at Microsoft. And today I sit within the Cloud Hardware Supply Chain group at Microsoft, focused on strategy and transformation, very specifically looking at this technology as a tool for transformation. So let me take you on a little bit of a journey with my French bicycle here in Paris. As I mentioned, I co-founded the work here at Microsoft on blockchain. I come at this from a very digital native perspective, and it's something that, if you look at the qualities of almost anybody coming out of college today, they're pretty much digital natives. And so this is the future of, future of our world. I like to say I'm techno-curious. I've been doing lean startup both in the enterprise and in startups for quite some time. As was mentioned, I teach e-commerce. I've also taught digital marketing, and very specifically actually created a course on intrapreneurship that I taught through the NYU program for some corporate clients. And that journey was interesting for me because it actually started happening, or it was coincident with my journey in blockchain at Microsoft. So really interesting to be able to actually put some of those practices into play myself. My self-attested history, I use those words very specifically, is at LinkedIn, and then you can also find me on social, particularly on Twitter, where I spend a good amount of time. So if you think about like the journey of the technology industry, which which, by the way, I was in college in 1984, so this largely matches my career. There's a number of interesting waves of technology that happen from the personal computer to the database to moving into email and client-server email, and the internet, obviously, in the 90s. Mobile and wireless, for me, really started in 2000 when I jumped into the wireless internet space. Cloud computing emerged, right? iPhone, remarkably in 2007, 7 years after really the sort of the internet mobile wireless wave started. And then if we look at, just examples of how do we take advantage of these technologies together, in 2009 was the emergence of Uber, right, and Airbnb. Remarkably, products like Uber are doing things for us that are extremely utilitarian, but also completely violate most of the norms that our parents taught us about, don't get into a car with a stranger, right? But have been facilitated by the digital technology that we see. And this was also the emergence of a technology called Bitcoin, which I would say is, a technology very specifically focused on creating something called hardened money, and was the result of the publishing by an unknown publisher, and probably many people have read this story. A guy or persons or group or woman named Satoshi Nakamoto really published this as a result of the 2008 crisis in the mortgage and the housing markets, that specifically had to do with people being able to leverage the same asset many times and creating essentially, a market crisis. Bitcoin, of course, gives you the ability through this technical foundation to have digital uniqueness. And that is the marvel, one of the marvels of this technology that enables us to have digital coins. And this is not something that we've ever had. If you look at the history that I show here on the screen, as I mentioned, I started in computer science in college in the early 80s, and actually I followed this wave. So this is my journey as well. I didn't actually spend time on the internet in the mid 90s, which I left Microsoft in 2000 because I wanted to do the wireless internet wave properly, and Microsoft wasn't really focused on mobile at the time. And so, wind that forward, just to sort of bring full circle back to e-commerce here. In 2010, just a data point, obviously, Amazon already had $34 billion, right, in revenue. 15 years prior, in 1995, nobody had the concept of either Uber or Amazon, right? And so we want to think about digital innovation waves, or innovation waves, and particularly digital innovation waves, as things that can move quite quickly. Though blockchain really emerged as academic studies across a number of areas, for many, many years, actually, Bitcoin was one of the zeitgeist moments, right, of blockchain. And then really people started talking about the technology after the emergence of the interesting, phenomenon of Bitcoin. And so in 2015, really blockchain started to become more than Bitcoin, right? It became a technical foundation upon which we can create hardened data. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this. Early in our journey, I mentioned I started this work in 2015 with a colleague. This was actually an opportunity for us in early 2016 to ship a product well before we had an engineering team that enabled development, like software development using blockchain technology. And so we collaborated with the two gentlemen on the screen here. You may recognize a couple of them. Obviously, I'm in the picture here. The gentleman next to me is Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, who came into role in 2014. One of the reasons why I came back to Microsoft, because I saw him coming from the cloud business. It would actually be the pivot that I was expecting to happen in the late 90s. That finally happened once he came into role. And then the other two gentlemen in the picture here are early pioneers in the blockchain space. Vitalik Buterin was really the mastermind behind the thing called Ethereum, which is basically the second largest blockchain from a market cap value perspective, but from a development perspective, it is the primary development platform that people use for blockchain development, both in the enterprise as well as in the open source communities. And a gentleman next to him is a wonderful colleague at a company called Consensus, who was doing business development there, is now actually running his own company, which is a financial derivatives product offering company. So this was sort of the beginning of our journey. Remarkably, if you think about startups, right, we were able to ship a product in a matter of months from nothing. And this was, I would credit the open source community with actually helping us to do this. So, we look at a number of examples in this session, from, how do you think about blockchain? And really, this is a technology that allows us to digitize trust. It also allows us to do something that I like to call, digital uniqueness, which doesn't just apply to money, right? Digital uniqueness applies to anything we want to do in a technology sphere with a large domain, a global domain, where we can digitally uniquely recognize something. We talk about, for example, in supply chains, we talk about unique serial itemization or serial identification of items at the serialization level, right? We talk about digital twins. These are all examples of things that need to be digitally unique, or else we don't have actual representation of a single item, right, or a component, or even raw goods. So there's a really important facet of this technology that's introduced, and I mentioned global domain importantly here because when you are dealing with data in a supply chain context and you're combining together lots of components from lots of different manufacturers, you have to think globally, and you have to think about how does a manufacturer of a particular component identify that good in such a way that I can also recognize their unique identification. And this is not a matter of just slapping barcodes or RFID onto a piece of good, because we've been doing that for years, right? And it hasn't necessarily sort of shifted the landscape in terms of how we think about technology patterns and technology. And that is largely because we haven't had digital uniqueness. And this is really one of the things that I think is the magical invention of blockchain technology. It's bringing us this ability to digitally represent things, people, goods, IoT devices, drones, etc., in a digitally unique way in a global domain. And that's a very important difference between how we have addressed itemization in the past, as well as how we've built systems in the past. We've had, in my entire career before blockchain, was building siloed systems. And when I say siloed, I mean systems that were designed to work well inside the enterprise. If you talk to most people in an IT enterprise organization, they're thinking about, how do I do this thing that really helps me be efficient? The reality is that we live in a global networked world and a networked world of devices. And so we need to shift our thinking to not just working inside of our enterprise, but working across a value chain of parties. And so there's really important qualities that this technology enables that allow us to do that in a different way. And we'll touch on some of those as we go through this. We like to talk about trust being foundational to key business processes. The reality is that any intercompany relationship is built upon trust, but it's also built upon contractual obligations, right? And so how do we monitor those contractual obligations along with the trustful relationships that we have with the participants, such that we can actually have efficient business processes? What often happens, though, is there's a lot of friction between parties at the boundaries of the organization because of how we have traditionally designed systems within the silos of our existing organizations. So what we sort of like to say is that the current methods, and this is sort of what I've been alluding to, of building trust, actually add friction. And blockchain, because it is looking at the world from the perspective of a network effect and a network of participants in a value chain immediately starts to remove the boundaries of the enterprise as this artificial construct of how we think about building systems, and allows us to be much more open and collaborative across the boundaries of our organization with our network value partners. This then allows us to start to look at objects across an entire supply chain as being digitally unique, as an example, right? That extends my domain beyond the boundaries of my enterprise. It also then allows me to think about the contractual obligations between the parties as shared business logic, and starts to give me the patterns that allow me to actually create shared business logic that let me do things like have a single view into the common set of data and objects that we work on across this network value chain. And I don't think I used the word ever in this presentation, so I'm going to use it now. One of the challenges of the way we build systems today is that it creates these silos of data and silos of understanding and silos of trust. And this actually causes one of the primary consumers of human capital across supply chains and banking and almost any contractual relationship. And the terminology is reconciliation. And reconciliation is what we have to do when you're looking at your data and I'm looking at my data, and we have to compare and reconcile what's the truth, right, between those two data sets. And this is one of the challenges of our, our current systems. And blockchain alleviates this because it lets us create a shared hardened data set that where we're both looking, or all parties, not typically it's not both, it's end parties, right, to a value chain, are looking at a shared set of facts that we don't question any longer. And this moves us from having to do data reconciliation into actually being able to solve business problems. So we actually reduce a significant amount of human capital, again, not just in supply chain, but in banking and many other industries around the problem of reconciliation. It's one of the huge benefits that we happen to see. I'm going to move past that. I mentioned before, we have been doing what we think is serialized itemization for many, many years. And we do it actually with standards bodies like GS1. This very, has been doing a lot of work in the barcode space. In fact, the originator of the barcode many, many years ago, and have done a ton of work in RFID. And these are ways of identifying different types of things, whether it's a pallet of goods or a container or a carton of goods, that enable us to very efficiently, as you can see in the bottom left-hand side here, scan and get that data, right? And so a lot of the automation that we've done in supply chain is about how do we make it more efficient to see what's in the box, right? And things like barcodes and RFID allow us to do that. It's actually not really thinking about the digitized itemization of the goods. It's really thinking about how do we make it more efficient to do an existing process. And so while that is actually driven dramatic improvements in warehouse operations and scanning operations, it hasn't actually really transformed what we're trying to achieve, which is digital uniqueness for items and for goods that we really want to represent digitally. So just a sort of a side point there. The other examples I'm going to use here is to help you understand that, like other technologies that people are very skeptical of in the early days, whether it's augmented reality and virtual reality environments, or artificial intelligence, which now has an application in every facet of everything that we do. Blockchain is a similar innovation journey, right? And these typically take 5 to 10 years, from early adopters to get to, much more massive adoption. And so where we are today in 2020, compared to 2015, or even, I think really remarkably 2018, 2019, is that the qualities of blockchains are very well recognized across enterprise, and this concept of digital uniqueness in a global domain is very well recognized. In addition, if you look at what's going on in the digital currency space, there's a significant amount of interest in central banks, and actually not just interest, but actual work, leveraging technologies to create digital currencies and moving from the types of currency systems that we have today into other types of currency systems. Now, central banks, if you know anything about them, are one of the most conservative organizations in the world for good reason, right? But I'll give you some examples here of where they're actually digging in various different regions of the world, looking at technologies. I want to highlight another relatively conservative organization on the world stage that does, if you know anything about the World Bank, you know that they do essentially development work in all different contexts around the world. And they do that through a combination of being a convening organization as well as a funding organization. So I had the wonderful opportunity in 2018 to start working with the Treasury organization within the World Bank on a blockchain-based bond. They envisioned having, using this technology to actually create a digitized version of a bond using, distributed ledger or blockchain technology. And doing this across banks. This was in collaboration with Commerce Bank of Australia. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and actually the Commonwealth Bank of Australia did much of the shared business logic and shared data structure work initially, and then we worked very closely with them to make sure that this could be stood up in a production environment within the World Bank cloud infrastructure, and their production cloud infrastructure is running on Azure, and so hence the relationship with Microsoft was pretty important to get this right from that perspective. And so this bond was a 2-year bond. It came to term in 2020, actually. So it's been relieved of its duty, but for 2 years it was a full life cycle of a bond. In an old world, left-hand side of the screen here, this was basically the different participants in this Australian issuance of a bond, and a set of investors. And so what this did was it helped to flatten the market, as well as make market operation extremely efficient, based on the underlying technology of this digitized asset, which happens to be resident on a blockchain. From the transactions perspective, this was a $110 million Australian dollar issuance, was about 80 million US dollars at the time. As I mentioned, it was a two-year tenor. I came to maturity in August 2020. They did coupon payments. Interesting, we went through this journey with them for 2 years where we had software upgrades as new features were added to this bond, to facilitate coupon payments, resale of a position by one investor to another, and new issuances, something called a tap, which happened as well. So we had about 3 software upgrades on this digital bond based on this technology foundation. Also, interestingly, it shows up on a Bloomberg terminal. So for anybody who's a Bloomberg terminal user, you would recognize this. And you can see down here at the bottom, basically this was issued and settled on blockchain, and requires access to the platform in order to be able to get to it. So I thought that was a pretty interesting reference. A couple of years ago, another example, Central Bank of Cambodia, which started doing some work on looking at how they could use digital currency technology on blockchain to actually start to transform what's happening in their environment, both in country as well as cross-border, thinking about wholesale banking relationships and retail banking relationships, and facilitate helping to uplift their retail banks across the nation. So the update, which is interesting, is this is actually just from October of this year. Sari Che is the central banker there, wonderful, obviously forward-looking central banker, and so she's just talking about the update of the work that they've done just recently, and she actually in the talk that she was doing, she actually demonstrates how the system works. So I thought that was a great example. Another example that I just saw recently was Visa and MasterCard have been doing work in this space, as well as Square and other payment vendors for some time. This is just a recent data point from Visa, where they're actually working using public Ethereum startup to do essentially stable payments in the environment. Another example that I really like is UNICEF. UNICEF started what they call a crypto fund a couple of years ago, and the thesis behind this was that using this technology, they could actually have greater transparency in how funding flows through the UNICEF network and into projects in the field, and also how those projects then are utilizing that funding, and have, essentially the transparency qualities of blockchain actually provide more value in the context of humanitarian development, humanitarian funding. So there was a couple of examples here from that of how it's being used in the field, whether it's in schools to, for example, one of the examples is they're actually, it's not on this particular screen, but they're actually using blockchain technology to track broadband speeds all over the world. And so if you're interested in that category, you can find that as well. This comes out of the innovation group at UNICEF, led by Chris Fabian and others there that are doing great work. The one quick update here on this, this is just recently, as you can see, from November. This is actually a presentation by one of the recipients of this fund in the field, and sort of they're talking about what's the benefits that they saw. And it's really looking at three qualities here, right? The ability to, for them in an emerging market, protect their value, right? So they're getting something that's in a non-local inflationary risk currency. They get transparency, as I was mentioning, as a key aspect of this. And then as well as payment efficiency, which is not something we really touched on, but the ability to easily transfer payments or have value associated with unique digital items. And this is how we think about this in a supply chain context. And to actually do balance payments quickly. So let me touch on, I'm just putting my clock in front of me here so I know to keep moving. Let me touch on the internet as a human right aspects and things that are important. This is Tim Berners-Lee, one of the grandfathers or founders of the web. It has a number of things that he's focused on, obviously, in terms of value propositions for the web, but also recognizes and has stated so that there's some significant design flaws in how we've built the web. So I'm going to just really take you through a very quick example here of how I think about why the web is broken for various reasons. So obviously, everyone participating is a web user, or we wouldn't be participating today in this way. So everyone, 100% of our participants are on the web. A lot of us are in the US, right? So as an example, in the US, a lot of us use Facebook, right, as a source of everything. If you want to call it truth in your world, you can, but it's certainly a source of social media information. How many of us use a device like an iPhone or an Android device like a Samsung, S, Galaxy or what have you? And these are great tools, right? Great utilities. If we look at the cellular market in the US, this is actually a cellular coverage map. There's about 5 different colors on this map because there's about 5 different cellular providers in the United States, providing different types of coverage with their different technologies. And do you search the web, right? Do you use products like Bing or Google to search the web? And the answer to all of those is, well, yes, but so what, right? And by the way, if you're using AOL Mail still or paying for AOL Mail, you should probably stop doing that because that was a little bit a while ago. But what's the problem here? The problem is that the internet's actually concentrated in a very small number of providers. And these providers are all commercial entities, nothing against commercial entities, but they're all seeking to make their buck and their rent essentially from the operation of the web, which was somewhat by design, somewhat by mistake. But the bigger problem is that it's concentrated, right? We talked here about 3+ mobile operators for cellular, really want to do dominant search engine providers, a couple of dominant mobile device providers. We didn't talk about the domain name service, but there's about 5 dominant domain name service providers. And that, as I mentioned, this was the conversation I was having yesterday with one of my colleagues. And there's about 3+ certificate authorities, which provide the secure certificates for doing things like a e-commerce transaction over a secure connection. That's a small number, right? That to me says vulnerability, right? It's very easy to disrupt something when there's a small number of providers. And more importantly, these are choke points, right? So these small number of providers also control what we actually as consumers view as, and Tim Berners-Lee said on one of the prior slides there, essentially a human right? Like, the internet is our tool of interacting in the world, is our tool for actually crossing the digital divide, no matter where we are in the world. Why should it be dominated by a small handful of providers that in many regions of the world could be controlled by the government as well, right? And so we've also seen recently in the US some concerns around our net neutrality laws and the takeover or the change in those. So just a sort of counterpoint here. The internet, though, even despite this, right, has been successful beyond our wildest imaginations, right? We're doing online education, we're doing virtual sessions like this one and webinars, we're doing B2B processing and online shopping like we never imagined that we would do. And like, I don't know when the last time I visited a bank was, right? Like, all my banking is online, right? As is, I think, most people today. Just some examples of different types of marketplaces that are out there, whether it's an Amazon or a Tmall in China, or an Etsy, which is a little bit more of an artisan's type of marketplace. I mentioned earlier the examples of different types of applications that we're using today that we never dreamed of using, things like taxi applications, whether it's Japan Taxi or Via or Lime or Lyft or Uber. And this is a combination of the utility of these tools with all different types of sensor technology coming together in this small device that allows us to do the simplest thing, but is like something we can almost not live with, at this point in time, which is use my location to determine where there's a close offering from a service provider to get me in a vehicle that somebody owns or leases that takes me from one place to another and gives me a price to do that, right? That's a really interesting marketplace, something that no one ever thought about in the mid 90s when we think about how these technologies evolve. And that's sort of the importance that we want to think about when we think about new technologies, is we probably can't imagine today what the qualities of this new technology will allow us to do in 5 to 10 years. And just an example here, right? Like, no one ever thought that we would build electric scooters that would have the same type of utility as an Uber, right? And that you could just leave a scooter on the corner and go unlock that scooter, right? If you recall Zipcar, right? Zipcar was one of the first examples where we had basically a vehicle you park anywhere in a neighborhood. You can find that vehicle based on location. You can unlock that vehicle after you've paid for, your reservation, essentially, for that vehicle. And that's basically what, the Lime scooter example is, right? And really interesting, sort of variant on that from a Lime scooter example is there's no driver, right? You're the driver, right? And so this is, sort of taking this idea of a taxi cab owned by or leased by a driver, that requires a driver, and moving you now to this next level of utility, which is, it's completely one, it's electric, right? But which is great. And two, so you can see the batteries on it, right? Which is another sensor that has to be there. So it's a very interesting aspect of, just how technology evolves. And of course, another similar marketplace disrupting the hotel industry is products like Airbnb that allow us to rent out parts of our suites, right, as well. Obviously, there's some issues. There's a lot of fraud, piracy, identity theft, as I mentioned, controlled by a relatively few number of providers, and that's quite problematic from a control perspective. So I'm going to really quickly do a quick detour on money because I think this is an interesting area to think about as we think about blockchain technology, because as you saw, central bank digital currencies based on the qualities of a technology like blockchain are now becoming sort of a thing. And so if we think about money, what is money? How do we value money? The easiest way I like to think about what money is it's a utility that allows us to actually do something on a regular basis where the same number of coins actually have the same outcome, right? So a great example is coffee, right? If you drink coffee or tea, I can buy a cup of coffee in Tennessee or New York today for a couple of dollars. My full expectation is that I can do that next week for a couple of dollars, right? And that's not going to change, right, generally over time. However, in some economies it does, and we'll take a look at, briefly at that. As we move things away from banking institutions or physical banking institutions, obviously we come into the digital realm of banking. And on the right-hand side here, actually, this check images and check deposit by scan was actually something that was the ability to take a check, which is, for your services, for example, and deposit those using basically a sensor technology on the device, right? Scanning it, recognizing what it is, having the bank be able to recognize that there was, value in that, and it was a real check with some controls, right? Obviously from a banking institution perspective. But that's one of the sort of the key things that's happened in the last 10 years in banking is this move from physical to fully digital to even being able to have digital deposits essentially through even through a physical check. But there are some problems with this. In the United States, for example, the dollar's inflation rate was 3% for the first 120 years. And the government created this great thing called the Federal Reserve to quote unquote maintain the stability of the financial system and contain systemic risks. But the problem is that it actually didn't do that. It created other problems, and we've had an inflation rate that's quite high for the last 100 years. And if you look at how this occurred, this is actually, if you go back to, I mentioned I started in college in the 1980s, so like 1983 going to 2013, where this chart ends, you can see that the value of the dollar during my career has basically dropped by half, right? And so what that means is that my spending power, right, though my salary is going up, my spending power has gone down dramatically, right, over my career. So that's kind of a problem. And it's certainly a problem when we look at examples where inflation is rampant in other countries. And I'm not going to scan through this whole video, but this is basically just over time looking at the changes in inflation rates in different regions of the world, and so you can see it's ebbing and flowing, and eventually I think we end up towards the end of this with sort of massive inflation. Here you can see it that's happened in Venezuela to the point where currency in Venezuela is essentially not valuable anymore. This is an example of that. I've seen recent examples as well on the internet where basically the local physical currency is just doesn't have any worth, and you can see that from the inflation perspective, right? Let me jump through a couple of these. In the blockchain category, we have this thing called cryptocurrencies. This is actually an old chart. If anyone's following the price of these tokens or currencies that were created, I want to make a couple of points here. Actually, before I do that, let me just jump to the current price so as not to confuse anyone. Here you can see this is a chart from the fall of 2019, where the price and the market cap of Bitcoin and Ethereum were respectively, 7,500 and 163. And here you can see a year later in 2020, that these are at almost $20,000, which is, by the way, one of the highs of Bitcoin and Ethereum. And that's to say one thing. Cryptocurrencies, because they don't have a lot of distribution, they're fairly limited in their distribution and supply. They are extremely volatile, and this is the case of any limited supply or any sort of limited market thing. So it's not always going up. So just, you know, that yes, it's been a good year, but it is highly volatile, and it's highly volatile because of that. But what's important about this is these technologies are fully open sourced public internet technologies that are protecting the value of these market caps. And to date, the core infrastructure of the underlying blockchain systems have not been hacked, right? And so the fact that there's a market value of $360 billion or $70 billion of these technologies is an important metric as we think about what does it mean to have a hardened, distributed, open source technology that we can rely on for digital trust and that we can rely on for digital uniqueness. Each one of these dollars, right, in these two systems represents digital uniqueness and represents years of trustworthiness, right, around the technology. So it's a really why I think it's important to look at the aspects of the currency here. And obviously for people who are in finance, there's other interesting aspects to this as well. Okay, so volatility clearly is there, but there are also stable tokens and stable coins in the market that I want to touch on, because those actually help us in when we think about payments and settlement and trade finance and easing cash flow. They give us, stable coins give us a digital representation that is stable, where we can actually, instead of having the type of volatility you see between this year, right, which in this case is a volatile growth year, which is good. But if you're thinking about payments, that's not actually something you want to use for payments. You want to use something that's stable. And here you can see, for example, there's something called Tether. There's other examples that don't happen to be on this chart that are sitting at $1. Those are actually stable coins that have various ways of being pegged to the value of $1, which allow you to keep your currency digital, but actually move it into something that doesn't have the volatility of a true cryptocurrency like Ether or Bitcoin. So it's designed to be stable. Very similar to the concept of fiat money that we just talked about, which is designed to be stable, but is, you know, has an inflationary problem. So that allows us to now have digital payments and digital value transfer in areas like settlement, trade finance, and et cetera. And so there's also whole charts of stable tokens and stable coins as well. I mentioned Tether. There's a whole slew of different examples. And they all typically don't fluctuate very much because they're designed to be stable, right? And they're designed to stay close. Now, what's also interesting here is you can see all these listed in blockchain here. They're sitting on top of the construct of a token standard on the Ethereum blockchain called ERC20, which is sort of one of those de facto standards that happens when you're pre-world standards organizations and you just have dominance in a market. And so this has been a way that's actually been quite useful for creating different types of currency environments. There's something called DAI here, which is interesting. I think I went into a little bit more detail on DAI. I'm not going to do it today. But I think it's important to think about this global domain, as I mentioned earlier, because global domain gives us global uniqueness. And that's an important construct. Those currencies are built and those stable coins are built on something called public Ethereum. We also have enterprise versions of the same technology, which have been adapted to the characteristics and the qualities of enterprises around things like transaction privacy and security and metadata privacy and the things that we would want in a supply chain network where we have competitors. So same technology, a different use case. Let me skip a little bit forward because I know we're getting close to the end of my talk time here. So, you know, as you look at what are some of the issues that we've talked about the web and how, you know, blockchain might be able to help that. One, these are sort of some of the issues that we need to deal with, move away from a smaller number of systemic central actors that I mentioned earlier into a more decentralized and governed decentralized environment, have an incentivization mechanism to keep the decentralization true. Right. And so this is like today, we don't really have an incentivization mechanism on the internet. To have built-in payments, micropayments, value transfer in a transaction layer, to have identity, the ability to have digital uniqueness is basically identity of things and people, not just web pages like the web today, to have personal ownership of your data, including your identity. And we actually work with a not-for-profit called ID 2020, whose mission is identity as a human right, particularly looking at emerging markets and development examples of, you know, how do we actually help people protect themselves and protect their data. And this is facilitated through essentially a root of trust that's owned by individuals. And in the case of something like a distributed system, like a public blockchain, it's actually owned by the people, right? Owned by the world. So how do we think about this from the perspective of blockchain's promise being able to address this? Characteristics of blockchain: decentralization, privacy and trust built in, designed in, essentially. You know, open, right? Everything that I just described is open, and it doesn't have a single owner, right? And so some of the qualities that are problematic for the web today actually are addressed by this technology that transcends the borders of a single enterprise. So things like governance mechanisms to arrive at consensus about a decision. You can think about this in the context of a board. You can think about this in the context of a software upgrade across enterprises. From a digital root of trust, this is really public key infrastructure. What blockchain does is it actually creates a distributed public key infrastructure, and so we can use that to help with identity and this root of trust. Shared business logic that we both agree upon, and that is part of arriving at consensus about a decision. That we both can see what that business logic is. So we can actually take contractual obligations and code them into a hardened shared logic systems, again, that doesn't stop at the boundaries of our enterprise. The focus on full end-to-end value chain of systems and network value versus siloed systems focus, where we design and build just for solving for ourselves. And then obviously domain is important, particularly when you're starting to think about identity and the globalness of the internet. So having a global domain context for all these things is also quite important. So these are things that actually, you know, at blockchain actually is, right? These are qualities of blockchain at the technology level. And so it is an area where we can start to envision how we would actually create identities that we own. And we're doing this work at Microsoft through the context of our identity enterprise team. So I'm going to just skip through a couple of these very quickly here, and I will wrap up so that we can actually do some Q&A. Just a sort of reflecting on this journey that we've been on, like in 1995, when Windows 95 was shipped, and it contained a full TCP/IP stack, which, you know, basically put consumers on the internet. You know, people ran out of the store like this guy, right? Like saying, "Wow, I can, you know, use the Web 2 stack, and you know, I'm on the internet." And of course, that's not what was happening, really. People really didn't realize that, right? And this is sort of where we are, right, in blockchain. People are not realizing where we are. This is more like the typical digital native of today, right? It's a lot of social context, you know, around what's the value of this thing called the internet and what's openness mean. And I guess, you know, as we move forward, you know, we can embrace this and think about decentralized governance and how we actually move from these sort of central areas of control into more what I would call quote unquote democratic or democratized systems, and move away from sort of the surveillance society, though we're in it, right? I mean, as I mentioned, like, we don't have all the answers, right? We do have tools. We have to choose to use those tools, and we have to choose to go in the direction of betterness versus just sort of settling for the status quo. From a consumer perspective, again, this is actually in Rockefeller Center in New York City last year. There's a lot of zeitgeist moments happening where blockchain is really getting into the hands of consumers. And that was actually what I was highlighting on this particular screen. At the bottom half of the screen, you can see that the Galaxy phones from Samsung actually have a blockchain key store on them. That is a consumer tipping point example. And then also Opera, which has about 300 million users around the world and a lot in emerging markets, also has a built-in wallet and key store capability in the browser. So I think we're going to see in the browser space, we're going to see this evolution where more and more of the browser technologies are adopting what Opera has done. And the fact that Microsoft Edge and Google Chrome are now based on the same Chromium engine gives me a lot of hope that that it's going to be pretty easy to cross that chasm for both those companies as well in the relatively near future. So I've talked a lot about supply chain value chains. This is just an example. Again, I want to get to questions, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But when we build distributed systems, we need to think about the whole value chain, and we need to think about how this entire system actually benefits all parties and includes the consumer in that benefit, right? And so, again, blockchain is a technology that allows us to transcend the borders of a single siloed enterprise quite easily. And that's why it's been so meaningful in the supply chain space. Two slides and then I'll be done here. There is architecture patterns that are important to think about from a technical perspective. You're not just standing up a blockchain and you're done. You're actually building an application. Like, this thing requires an application layer, right? Both for a consumer as well as for all of the individual businesses that are working across this value chain. And so how you think about that from a blockchain stack perspective is really the left side of this chart. You build up from the underlying data structure and systems that support the basics of blockchain. You obviously have to put an interface library and an API into that, control access to the API for the enterprise applications, and allow you to do things like have that consumer on the right-hand side actually see what they're allowed to see, right, in that system from a transparency perspective. And then from an enterprise perspective, the same thing, right? And so these front doors basically just a control point. But we create an API here that can then also be interfaced into internal enterprise systems in each one of these entities. So that they're seeing their typical user applications for the things that they do in their warehouse and in their boats and in their shipment systems and at retail connect through an API into this value chain. So we're not building what I would call a rich user experience right here. We're building the foundation for trust in data that connects into other systems through an API. So important point there. I think I can skip this one, and I will leave you with one question that you should think about. Coming back to my French bicycle. When you look back in 2 years, this is a construct I like to use. What will you be able to say you have done or built or how you've changed the world? So thank you very much. Let's open up for questions.
Thank you, Yorke. That was great. That was great. Very informative. And yeah, I think that's a great question. I want to go back just to something you mentioned just a few minutes ago about how Microsoft Edge or and Chrome are, their base, whatever you want to call it, is using Chrome. Did you say Chromium? Am I saying that?
Yeah, Chromium is the underlying stack that
the underlying, thank you. Yeah.
Now Edge has adopted the same stack.
Yeah. So we're seeing that, if browsers are integrating, cryptocurrency or blockchain application into their stack or into their, functionality as a browser,
Mhm.
Now, a lot of the questions have focused around what can we do to advance adoption of and
Yep.
push adoption of blockchain on a larger scale. I think even with the election, I'm not trying to get political here, but there was this news article that came out that said, well, what if we, made mail-in ballots or did mail-in ballots via blockchain or did, voting via blockchain? Um, and they said that the technology was not there to handle that and it won't be here for a while. Now, that was an article I read. Not sure how true that is, but I guess in the grander scheme of things, what can people in the industry or outside the industry do to advance adoption, whether it's on a larger scale through governmental agencies, just in society in general? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I pointed out the consumer technology stacks as a tipping point because what happened in Web 2 is that the technology stacks got there before the consumers got there, and so it's an important building block, and that's why I point out this idea that if we get the basic constructs into our consumer web stack and our consumer devices, that then the developers will start to be able to utilize that, right? And so those are important parts of an adoption journey that we as individuals that don't work for those companies really can't do anything about, but that will be a part of the transformation journey. And I think that's an important aspect. On the enterprise side, we do have control, right? On the enterprise side, we build applications, and we need to build applications with the mindset that we're building a network of value, right? We're not building an application that's just a value to us. We're actually building for our value chain parties. And so when we do this work in supply chain at Microsoft, that's the way we think about it. And the experience that we've had in doing that is we've started to really look at where some of the enterprise systems that we're using actually have gaps that prevent us from doing things in an easy way, where blockchain, because of its qualities of the network and the hardened, trusted, shared view of data, actually opens up those opportunities. And so I think that's, again, why I've been spending so much time in supply chain. It is a key place where we have networks of value chains that is really the design principle and meets the design principle of the technology. I think the question that you raised is an interesting one around voting. My personal opinion, it's not necessarily the opinion of Microsoft, and it's definitely not the opinion of some longtime cryptographers that I talked to about it, is that we could design a blockchain-based both voting and identity system that would actually facilitate much more secure voting than we have today. And it's a matter of doing the design right? It's not necessarily a matter of the technology. It's a matter of how you're applying the technology to facilitate the interesting patterns that we need and requirements that we need in voting, where we show up, and you just model out like what's the physical requirement. You show up at a voting place where you're registered, you check in so they know it's you, then they give you an anonymous number, right, that you use to actually go facilitate your vote, and then that gets rolled up into a system, right? And so what are the qualities that we need to replicate in that, and what are the things that we'd actually want to get out of it from a consumer transparency perspective that would be an advancement, right? And that's how you have to look at any system, and voting is just an example of any kind of design transformation that we want to do. And I think we can do that. Again, it's my personal opinion.
Great, that's a great answer. I agree on all those fronts. One of the questions.
By the way, just on the government side, there's a tremendous amount of work going on in government, both in supply chain as well as in, as I mentioned, this concept of digital currencies around the world, right? So there is a lot of work going on. What I would say is that in the way that this shows up to me, and I think what I would suggest to people is, no matter where you go into work or where you choose to go to work, raise your hand and look for the people who have similar beliefs, right? From a technical perspective, and say, hey, I'm here, I'm an enthusiast in this area. I want to know what you're doing because I want to be involved in this work. And by the way, I have people coming out of the woodwork to me literally 2 or more people per week look me up and say, hey, I just arrived at Microsoft. I'm in the Edge team, or I'm in the Office team, or I'm in the Dynamics team, but I want to do blockchain work. So like, how can we collaborate, right?
Yeah.
And this is how technology changes, right? This is how we're seeing this in the US government, right? The US government, the young representatives that have come into the US government have a different mindset, right, than people who have been in government for 30 years, right? And that's important, and that's how technology changes.
So in that respect, and this is something that affects quite a few people here locally, when we look at the newly enhanced partnership with FedEx and Microsoft, FedEx Surround, I don't know how much detail you can go into it, but what are some of the things, or how can blockchain, given that FedEx has said blockchain is a big focus for them for in the coming years, in the coming future, how can that partnership and what you're doing be all, molded together into one kind of happy package?
Yeah, I mean, I sit in supply chain at Microsoft, so obviously FedEx is a key collaborator, in logistics, and FedEx sits in an interesting place in the ecosystem, as do other logistics providers. But specific to Microsoft and FedEx, we've had a lot of conversations with the FedEx teams about how we can, do some proof of value and proof of concepts around using this technology. I think we have a unique opportunity to do this in supply chain with FedEx, and so it's one of the ongoing conversations that we're having, with folks at FedEx. Just to touch on, FedEx sort of being like other logistics providers, being at the center of commerce around the world, that actually puts the FedEx mindset into very much of a global domain. And I think that's an interesting context to have to think about. And I remember in early conversations a couple of years ago with FedEx, this was one of the key challenges, is like, we sit at the center of commerce. How do we actually think about what is our value chain, right? It really touches the world, right? And so the domain of FedEx is very much a global domain. And so what better technology to actually address that, right? From a transactional perspective, I think that's a huge opportunity.
Great, that was a great answer. Thank you for that. I think we're a little over time, so I'll only take one more question. And it was this question asks, how many players have the infrastructure to facilitate large-scale adoption or blockchain-based applications?
I think this is a great question. I think the better question is, how many large players have the desire, right, to be on the bleeding edge of innovation? And I think that's a better question, right? Because we have lots of large players, right, around the world. I like being at Microsoft because Microsoft has a number of sort of both on the consumer side value propositions, as well as our cloud footprint, which is a worldwide cloud footprint, and all of the application stacks and Lego building blocks that exist inside of our inside of our tool sets. My personal belief is we do have some very unique opportunities as a company, but I would not say that we're unique in our ability to really be on the bleeding edge. I mean, there are lots and lots of other companies that are doing fabulously interesting work in the blockchain space. And so what I try to do is I try to collaborate with those people who have opted in, right, to be on the bleeding edge of a digital transformation journey, because those people have the same, their mindset is the same, right? And so if you get, 5 people with the same mindset, in terms of how they think about adopting technology, it's much easier than trying to drag forward somebody who doesn't have the same mindset, who has made a decision, right, as a corporation, that they want to be on the trailing end of innovation, right? And that's fine, right? There's all different types of organizations in the world. By the way, there's a ton of questions in here about all different types of technology, including IPFS and baseline, and
Yeah.
I'd be happy to spend more time talking about those. Both are fascinating technologies, and I think have many different applications. Baseline in particular is really designed to think about the enterprise qualities that we would want in a fully public distributed system where enterprises like FedEx and Microsoft could transact, and what would have to be the qualities that would enable that. And that was really the design principles of Baseline. And I think we're seeing that play out quite well with a tremendous amount of community engagement. So I'm actually quite excited about that. And that was an initiative that was a collaboration with two other like-minded organizations, Ernst & Young and Consensus, Consensus being a blockchain boutique, one of the largest blockchain boutique consultancies in the world. The three of us got together and basically said, like, if we're gonna make public blockchain real for enterprises, what does that mean, right? Like, how do we get there and what do we have to do? And so we put together these patterns and then contributed it to open source community. And the community is just going gangbusters. It's fabulous.
Okay, great. Well, maybe we can follow up on some of those other points in more specialized sessions, but I think we've run a little over our time. So I do want to thank you, Yorke. Great presentation.